All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to show you what Lagoon can do for multi-sites. And let's jump right in. Let's first shortly, if you maybe never heard about Amaze.io or Lagoon, who we are, what we do. So Amaze.io is a managed cloud hosting company. We do completely hosting in containers. And because we do not rely on a specific infrastructure, we can pretty much host anywhere in the world. We provide chat support, which makes a lot of things much easier. So you don't actually have to interact with a ticketing system, but instead you can directly talk to us via chat. Also, everything we do is open source. Everything you will see today is going to be completely open source. You can look at it later. You can look at the code. You can see how it works. We really believe that also hosting platforms should be open source. And so this is why we open sourced it. And of course, we already have existing clients. We're going to talk about them a bit later, but these include governments, financial companies, universities, all kind of companies and universities, governments that need Drupal sites. Now, what is Lagoon? Lagoon is our container hosting platform. This means all the Drupal sites or any application is running in containers. And with that, you can actually run the same containers locally as in production. Again, it's completely open source and it is fully based on Kubernetes. So it is not our own proprietary solution. We use Kubernetes to run the containers, to manage them. Lagoon just makes it much easier for you to deploy your Drupal site in there. It's completely API first. So we have a GraphQL API where you can manage all your sites, all your code, things like that. And we're going to talk today a lot about Drupal, but because it's containers, Lagoon can run much more than Drupal. But today, we're going to focus on Drupal and multi-sites. So the agenda for today, first, we're going to shortly look into what are actually multi-sites. Why do they exist? Why they have been invented and what they're used for. Then we're going to look at the Drupal's internal solution for multi-sites, and we're also going to talk about the issues of it. Plus, then as a next, we're going to look into how Lagoon can actually solve these issues. We're going to have a short demo where I show you some sites, how they work. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A section as mentioned. But please ask questions if you see one right away in the QA functionality. Bastian will going to answer them today, and we're also going to have a short QA session in the middle where we maybe shortly go through some of the questions. All right, what are multi-sites? Well, as the name suggests, it's basically multiple Drupal sites, but with the same or a shared code base. But each of these sites have a different database and they also have different files. Plus each site has also its own domain. So this means from a visitor point of view, it looks like a completely different site. As a visitor, I'm actually not able to see if this is a multi-site or not. And because it has different databases, it also means that none of the content is shared by default. Each users need to log in into each Drupal site individually. There are ways to synchronize content and users and things like that, but the default installation does not have that. So you wonder, why do I even want to do that? I could just run completely separate Drupal sites. Well, if you talk about maybe 1, 2, or 3 sites, that's correct. But there are multi-site installations out there that have hundreds or even thousands of sites. And so their upgrades and security patches get very, very important. And you need to find ways how to do that. And this is what a multi-site actually tries to solve. It gives you a centralized system where you can centrally manage the code, and while the database and the files are different. So it provides easier management and easier possibilities for really big installations. But of course, also smaller installations can profit from this. One important thing, though, is that Drupal actually has another functionality called domain access. And the domain access site, or a site with domain access installed, is not actually a multi-site, even though it still can look as, from a visitor point of view, as completely different sites, because domain access allows you to run different content, different themes. But this is not what we're going to focus on today. Today, we're talking about multi-sites as the Drupal functionality of it. So let's look into Drupal's internal solution if you go and want to run a multi-site, how does it actually work? How does the whole system go? So if you Google for Drupal multisite, there's other ways of saying it, but we are going to use multisite today. And we can see that we have shared modules and themes. So basically on the right side here, we can see that we have core modules and themes, which is the shared environment that we're going to have. So we have a core module themes. They're going to be available for all the sites. And then we have individual sites under site/site name. So this will not be site/default anymore. It will be site/site1, site2, site3. And each of them have their own modules and themes folder. Important, there's no core folder anymore because core will always be shared. And there's its own files folder because each of the site has its own files directory. So this means if a site starts, the site itself will use all the core and the modules and the themes from the main, from the shared part, plus additional modules and themes that are maybe installed in that individual site. And what we don't see here, but it's important, each of these sites have an individual database by themselves. So they have, like I mentioned, they have different nodes, they have different users, things like that. Plus, you can define domains, and you define them in a file called sites.php, which includes an array that tells which domains should be mapped to which site. But this is the regular Drupal multi-site installation that you can find pretty much anywhere. So let's talk a bit about the problems of that system. First of all, we want to talk about updates. So as you can see, because we have a shared core modules and themes, if you update them, they will be, specifically core, will automatically be updated on all sites automatically. So this means you also need to run the database updates for each of the sites. Now, with 3 sites, you just run 3 times, maybe drush updb, or you go by the UI, but now imagine these are 1,000. You most probably cannot run all of them at the same time. So this means while you updated core, you have a bit of an unstable situation because the code base maybe has a new database schema, while the site 1, 2, and 3, they're not updated yet from the database. So during that situation, it can be quite unstable. And the worst is, let's assume you have a failure. Let's assume site 1 and 2 worked, the database update worked. Now you run site 3 and it fails. Now you have 2 possibilities. You can either roll back the code, all the shared modules and themes, and all the databases of site 1 and 2, or you can try to fix the database update for site 3. While site 3 most probably is going to be down, site 1 and 2 will still work, but now you're going to fix site 3. Now again, if this is only in 3 sites, it's not a big deal. But if you have 1,000 sites, suddenly an update across all these sites is going to be very time consuming, very stressful, and very, very hard to test. So Drupal multisite doesn't really provide you any possibilities to individually update a site from each other. Plus, rollbacks are also very, very hard. So this means, and if you ever managed Drupal multisite with many sites, updates are a very, very stressful time. Another problem are development instances. So as we are moving with Drupal into more modern development workflows, you maybe not only want to have a production site, but you also want to have development site, staging environments, things like that. How can you do that with a multi-site? So the first possibilities is you just create multiple sites. So instead of just having one site 1, we have site 1-prod, and we have site 1-dev. We have site 2-prod, site 2-dev. So you have 2 different ways, no problem at all. The thing though, now if you update core again, it will automatically update dev and prod at the same time. While you probably want to first test maybe a core update on dev before you run it on prod, and this is not possible with that system. There is another way of doing that. Instead of having multiple different types of the same site in one multi-installation, we create multiple multi-site installations. So that means on the first one, we have all our prod sites, while on the second one, we all have our dev sites. That's possible, but again, if you want to now have a staging environment, you will now clone everything again. So you have many clones of many sites that you maybe don't use or maybe don't need. And this makes it, again, very complicated, very hard, very in time intensive. So again, Drupal Multisite, if you want to have modern development workflows, unfortunately, they don't really solve that problem. The next thing, and this is also connected to bigger sites or modern solutions, you might want to have multiple Git repositories. So let's assume that you are a government and you have different departments, and each of these departments have their own sites and they have their own themes. And now you want to provide a Git repository for each of them. Now, how do you do that? Well, the easiest would just be to have one core modules and themes, that's one Git repository. And then you have site 1, 2, and 3, you put into individual Git repositories. That's possible. The problem is, though, now that these Git repositories themselves, they completely lack core and all the shared modules and themes. They're not there. So running that locally is going to be very hard, because a developer now also needs to figure out, okay, which cores, modules do I want to use? And yes, there are scripts out there that can do that, but it's very easy to have mismatched versions, different databases that cannot be imported anymore, things like that. So very fast, it can get very ugly. And the next problem is also, you cannot give users access to these sites via Drush. So if somebody has access to the site 1, because the site 2 is right sitting there, that person could also run Drush on the other sites. And so multi-sites do not really allow you any permission systems, because if you have access to the site, you cannot provide in Drush any possibilities. So you see that there are quite some issues with Drupal multi-sites. They look very interesting from the beginning, but when you actually try to use them, when you try to leverage them for production stuff, for big sites, they get very complicated, very stressful, very fast. So this is why Amazee.io as a company and Lagoon as the open source tool, we do not support or recommend running multiple Drupal sites or running multiple sites with the Drupal multi-site feature. We really believe that modern development workflows need modern tools, and the Drupal multi-site feature, unfortunately, is not ready for that. So let's break here shortly and let's look at the Q&A. Bastian, do we have some questions so far?
We do not have any questions so far.
All right.
So we can go ahead.
Cool, let's continue. So let's look actually at the cool stuff. Let's look how can Lagoon, what can Lagoon do for your multi-sites? So it wouldn't be Lagoon if there is not just one solution, but two. So we have two solutions, and the first one is called Polysite. Now the Polysite is only for the case if you want to run the exact same Git repository for all your sites. There are cases out there where a Drupal multi-site is the exact same Git repository, and the difference of the different sites is only content and maybe some configuration, but not of the actual code base. Polysites is exactly built for that, where you can deploy the same Git repositories for 10, 100, 1,000 sites. Plus still have different databases and files for each of these sites. As mentioned, that's a special case, or it's probably more a narrow case, but we see that this is definitely used out there and can solve a lot of the issues because you have one Git repository that deploys multiple sites. The cool feature that we want to focus on today more is called the custom-based images. And basically what that allows is that you can give for each of your site, you have an individual Git repository where the developers can add modules and themes, but you still have a centralized and shared core modules and themes in a so-called base image. And as mentioned, each of the site can have their own modules and themes. They can manage it themselves. They can decide when they update. And so we want to look at that a bit more. But first, because we're talking about containers and we're talking about Docker images, let's first do a short recap for maybe people that never seen containers before. How does such a workflow actually work? So the first part is what, if you use Lagoon, you are using the Lagoon Drupal images. In here, we're using the example for PHP, but we have other images for Nginx, MariaDB, all kinds of services you maybe need, but we're just going to look at the PHP. And the PHP Drupal image has PHP installed and PHP config itself. And it lives inside the Lagoon Git repository. Again, it's completely open source, so you can look at it, you can look which versions are installed, you can send a pull request if you have something cool. So these Lagoon Drupal images, they contain everything that is needed to run Drupal in a container, but it does not contain any Drupal code in it yet. This is provided by you. If we use the official Docker images, for example, for PHP, this is how we get security updates and the newest features in there. And Lagoon just makes it Drupal able to run because the default PHP images cannot be used by Drupal. These images are maintained and published by the Lagoon maintainers, which is Amazy.io. But of course, we are accepting pull requests. We're also interested in finding other maintainers. So if you're interested in helping us with that, please talk to us. It's an open source tool, so we can definitely help all of each other there. So let's go back. We see the Lagoon Drupal images, they're there. But as I said, there's missing Drupal code. So this is coming over here on the right side. So the Drupal code, which lives inside the Git repository for your own site, in this case, it has core, modules, themes, and custom in there. And together, Lagoon will build out of these two images, will actually build a fully container image, which is then running on Kubernetes later. So this is the standard. If you're using Lagoon today, or most probably any container system that exists out there, this is what you're doing. You have some kind of images that you're using, and you add your Drupal code in it. But again, we can see there's no base image here. So let's actually look in now, how is the custom base image workflow different, and why does it solve a lot of these issues? So we start for the custom base images the same as we start with the regular one. We have Lagoon, this has a Git repository, no problem. Now we add another thing in there, which is called the base image. Now this base image brings every module's themes that you want to share and the Drupal core with it. So this is what you want to share across all your sites. And together, you create the so-called base image out of it. So the base image will be PHP config from the Lagoon images, plus core modules and themes from the base image itself. So what does that base image look like? The base image is basically just a regular Drupal installation with a couple of Docker files. We see an example on the right side about the CLI Docker file, and we can see it uses the Amazy.io PHP 7.2 CLI Drupal images. These is an example for an image that we have published. It comes from Lagoon. It's published under the name Amazy.io. And then it uses Composer to install additional stuff, and it runs Composer install, things like that. So all the core, the modules and the themes that you want in your base image are coming via Composer. You can add custom modules, no problem at all. And the really cool thing is, because this is a container and this is a Docker image, you can run that completely by itself. You don't have to create a multi-site from this to just test it. You can run the base image by itself. So this means you can fully automate the test the base image by itself, to make sure before you then you release that that it's working. And in order to release it, this is then pushed into a container registry. So this base image will be pushed there. It can be Docker Hub, where it's publicly available, or private, or you maybe have your internal company container image registry where you can also publish it into. So it's your choice where you want to publish them, and for your developers of the multi-sites to actually use that. So we have our base image, and now we actually want to create sites out of this. So on the right side, we have again a site Git repository. They are using these base images, but the important part now, it does not have any core anymore, and it also does not need any of the shared modules. It only adds now its own modules and themes that you want, or that the developers want to add to the base image. And together, or let's look at this one. So the Docker file for this one now uses, let's say your company is called organization, and you published your base image under the name base image. The Docker file for the individual site is using that base image, and it's just adding its own composer file where the additional modules and themes are defined. By the way, we're talking about Drupal 8 here. It also works with Drupal 7. So it's also possible. It obviously will not use Composer, but there are other tools out there for Drupal 7, but it's going to be exactly the same. And the system itself works with both of them. So we can see it uses the base images. You can add anything you want to it via Composer or via any other tools. And again, because this is now a container, you can run it locally. So as a developer, I add my composerjson and my composer log, and I run it locally, and I have all the base stuff, the core modules and themes in there, plus my own, so I can run that locally, and I never have to be worried about different versions, because if there is a new change from upstream, if you update your base image, let's say the new core version, you just publish a new image, and the developers will pull them and rebuild them and have the newest version locally already there with maybe any patches that you have in the core and things like that. So it's all already there, and I can locally work. So, and based from here, it's actually the regular container workflow. So this site image is not different than any regular Lagoon image or Lagoon workflow. This now is just pushed into Lagoon, and Lagoon will deploy it. So Lagoon will create out of three Docker images, will now create a container image that will be run on Kubernetes and will be deployed for each individual site. So let's look at the advantages of that system that we just heard about. First of all, each site has its own Git repository, but it actually doesn't stop there. Each site also has its own containers, and each site has its own environment. So they're completely separate from different environments. So that means if one of them fails, no matter why, let's say a DrupalCon DB fails, or a developer pushes something that did something bad, and that site is broken, the other sites are not impacted because they do not share any code anymore when they're running. During the building, they take each other's code, but when they're running, they're not sharing any code anymore. And this also allows to give you individual permissions. In Lagoon, you can give a developer access to only one site for Drush. So that developer can only go into that site and run Drush there without having access for all the other sites. If you want to give a developer access to all the sites, that's also possible. We have a full role-based access control system in Lagoon, but it is possible to narrow it down only for one project or maybe even one for environment. And the good thing is about that system, you still can centrally manage and test your base images where core and the modules and the themes are going to live in. So you still have all the advantages of a multi-site where where you have a centralized system. As they are different individual containers, you can also have multiple environments per site. So each site can have their own dev staging production system where they do not share any code. And each of the developers, or if you decide I want to run a core update, you can run only the core update on dev first, and then on staging, and then on production. So you can be sure that when you actually run the production update, that all the database updates and all of them worked. Plus, the local development is super easy. All you do is you just go locally, you run Docker Compose up, and you can run all of this. Okay, a lot of talk. Let's actually look at a demo. So first of all, let's look at the base image. So on the left side here, we have a Git repository with our base image. If I run an ls-lisa, you can see that this has a Docker file for the CLI, the Nginx PHP. It has a composerjson. It has all kind of things that we need to run a regular Drupal site. If we look into that file in here, we can see, as we saw before on the slides, it uses the PHP 7.2 CLI, and it has all this stuff. And the composerjson has our Drupal core in there. So it uses Drupal core with 8.0, which the lock then will define which version exactly, stuff like that. So this is your base image. And what I can do, I can connect, because it's already running locally. I started the containers. So I can go in there, and I can run, for example, Drupal status, where I can see that this is a fully functioning Drupal site. It has its own URL. So if I go to this URL again on the left side, we have the base image site. We have content. I can work on this. I can see which modules installed. I can do all kind of stuff that I need to do locally on my base image. So for example, I check and I can see there is no paragraphs module installed because it's not part of the base image. Now let's go to this demo site 2. So this is a multi-site now, and we can see, and we will see that it has no core in it. So if we go here on the right side, this is the Drupal example Multisite 1. And if I look at this Docker file, you can see it uses Amaze.io development, which is our organization that we created for the test, for the demo. And we use the Drupal example base image CLI. So out of this image on the left side, we push them, publish them on Docker Hub, and now the multisite is using them. And if you look into that Git repository, you can see that there's no core anymore. There's no web folder. There is nothing in here because all of this is coming from the base image. All that this site does is it adds its own additional modules. And we can see that in the composerjson. So if I look into the composerjson, we can see that it uses a repository with in packages. This is used by Composer to actually know what is all containing in the base image. And we install, for example, Drupal paragraphs. We saw before the base image did not run paragraphs. But now my multisite itself adds paragraphs on top of it. And so if I go over here to my multisite that is running on the Drupal example multisite, we can see already here there is paragraphs in there. So if we go to the modules page, we can see that this site now has paragraphs installed while the base image did not have paragraphs installed. So this allows a developer to modify their multisite without touching any of the core, without needing to install core. It's already coming from the base image and they can just add their modules and their stuff on top of it. So, and if you want to actually add modules to it, you can just use the Composer workflow with Composer require, or if you have a custom module, that can also be added. So it's just a regular workflow that the developer knows, just without any cores or modules on there. So let's look at some additional features that unfortunately we don't have time to talk today about in the webinar, but we still want to mention them because they actually make the system really possible, especially if we have really big sites. So as I mentioned, the base image can be automatically built and tested via CI. So we have some customers that use like Dependabot or any other tool that automatically updates your dependencies. And every time that happens, there's a CI process that runs and that tests Drupal, that installs it, maybe synchronizes it from a specific site, and makes sure that all of this automatically works. So this allows for a fully automated system and that the computer or system can tell you if the newest version of core actually works with all your dependencies, stuff like that. Then the other interesting thing is, let's assume you have your multi-sites and the developer thought, oh, I'm really sneaky and I don't like the newest core version that the base image has in there, and they just override via Composer. Somehow they find a way to inject another core module, a core version or so. And so Lagoon has the possibility to actually talk to a CI system. So Lagoon will only deploy after an external CI system like Jenkins, Travis, GitLab CI, Circle CI, whatever you want to use as a CI system. Lagoon will talk to it first and first check if some specific test has been passed. And in these tests, you can run like Drutiny, Drush, or any bash scripts that you want. And in there, you can check that the core version has not been changed compared to the base image. So you can make sure that your developers are not changing something that you don't want, because you definitely don't want them to maybe remove a core patch, or maybe change a Drupal version, or change a specific module, or maybe install a module that you defined as a blacklist, things like that. So it is possible for you to keep full control over what is actually running in the end. Plus, as we talked about, we have customers that run hundreds of sites, and deploying them all manually is quite a hard process. So we have Ansible scripts that can deploy many sites at once. They will talk to the Lagoon API. So the Ansible script talks to the Lagoon API, figures out which sites are actually there, and will deploy all of them. And we have dashboards that show you where we are in the deployment process. If there's a failure, it shows you which site has failed. All of that is possible. Because Lagoon is fully API-based, you can talk to it, you can see what the status of all the deployments are. And we have customers like the Australian government that runs these upgrades just through the night. They run them in a couple of hours. We update hundreds of sites automatically to newest core versions, stuff like that. So let's look at some use cases. Where is that system actually be usable? So we have this system already running in a couple of installations. So governments obviously are very interested in that because you maybe have a centralized team that manages, let's say something like GovCMS, that manages a local distribution, and you want to have different departments that use this. And so that system is in use by GovCMS, and they can provide their local departments to develop their sites, deploy them, but still the central team can keep control over which core version is installed, stuff like that. We have a lot of universities that use the same system where each of the departments have their own developers and they then want to deploy these sites. We have big companies. Let's say you have a pharma company that needs to deploy a lot of sites automatically for medication that is slightly different in every country. This system is perfect for that. But we also have media companies that maybe have different sites, or they have a base image that have their best practices in there. And the same for agencies. We now see agencies using that system, even though each of the sites is individually, but because as soon as an agency manages 100, 200 sites, it gets very hard to, let's say on a core release, to upgrade all these sites. And it's much easier with that system as well. So, and we know that all of the system, this might sound very overwhelming right now, and it sounds very complicated, but we can help you here. So Amazy.io, we do consulting, and we actually do a lot of the management ourselves. So if you're interested in it, to use such a system beside or compared to the old system that was really hard, we really believe this new system with Lagoon and it being open source, that it provides a much better system for managing multiple sites, for handling them, for easier upgrading them, and at the end, provide all of us much more and better sleep. So that's it. I see there are some questions. Sebastian.
Yes, indeed, there are. So let me shortly pull that up. So Thomas asked, like, how should we organize the different exported Drupal configurations, shared configurations for all sites and some specific for one or multiple sites, like site name or so?
Yes. So he probably specifically refers to the configuration management system of Drupal 8. And yes, so what we've seen with Drupal 8 is definitely that the base image has their own config in it, which has like the default stuff, security settings, things like that. And now the multi-site can either provide their complete own config. So we can actually see, if I go back to my example over here, we can see that this multi-site has its own config folder. And if we look in here, that sync actually has a full config folder of Drupal. So in this case, the multi-site brings its own full configuration that can be overwritten by, or it is based on what is coming from the base image, but it will be its own. There's also the possibility that you use modules like config split or other modules inside Drupal core where you can start splitting up your multi-site, your configuration into smaller parts. So you could maintain the config, the main config still from the base image, and the multi-site will still use mostly of the configuration from the base image, and the individual multi-site can only overwrite it in some parts. But the question of giving the multi-site its own config or using like something like config split really depends on how vastly different your multi-sites are. So I think it's something we will need to talk about and see what exactly is the best, but there is definitely the possibility to either give full control or some smaller control over the configuration in the multi-site.
Oh, thank you, Michael. Another question is from Benjamin. He asked, is the composerjson from the base image or site code? Like all code should be defined there. So maybe explain again, like where and how the composerjson lives.
Correct. So both sites have a composerjson. Let's look at the composerjson of the base image first. So if I run, let's do that, it's gonna be easier. So the composer.json of the base image. So you can see here, this is the Drupal example base image. This is, from a composer point of view, just a regular Drupal installation where we define which core module we want and any of these modules. So for example, Redis, Search API, Search API Solar, Varnish, and Perch, these are just additional modules that are installed and they are being part of the base image. And that means all of these modules will be automatically also be part of the multi-sites themselves. And of course, the composer.json has a lot of other stuff, like any Drupal installation with Composer, but this is what we have in there. There is also a composer log, which is the log file for that specific composer file. Now, if we go to the multi-site over here, and if we look at the composer.json of the multi-site itself will require an packages repository, a packages package, which is based on that. So what we do is we publish this composer.json as a package on packages.org, and the multi-site will then use that. And it needs that for Composer to actually know that there is a core, because right now there is no core defined here. If you would remove that line, Composer would deinstall core and all that stuff that comes from the base image, but it still needs to know that this should be still installed, and it's actually already there. So if you run composer install, it will tell you that it's already there and it will not install it additionally. But you can install additional stuff in here. So we have Drupal paragraphs, what we saw before in the demo. This is what is used over there. So you have still two composer JSONs. One of them defines the base and the other one defines what you want additionally installed beside of all the packages that are coming from the base image.
Wonderful, thank you. Thomas has another question. Makes a custom base image workflow sense when we only have difference in configuration, but not modules or themes?
No, I think it definitely makes sense to have, even if you have different modules and themes for the individual multi-sites, the base image workflow can already help you, for example, with updating core. Because core is going to be installed on all of the sites. And we have now some agencies that where the modules that are installed on the multi-sites are completely different. Like they add 20 or 30 additional modules, while the base image only has core and maybe some modules that you want installed on all of the sites. And then what that company does, or what that team does, if there is a core update, they update the base image, they test everything. And now, instead of going into each of the sites and running Composer update, they just redeploy the multi-sites, or they redeploy these individual sites. And because core is now coming from the upstream, the update of core is much easier. You don't have to go into each of these Git repositories and say, Composer update, wait till it downloads all the core and figures out all the dependencies, because that is going to be happening automatically. So even if you have vastly different modules and themes inside these multi-sites images, the workflow still allows you to be much faster in updating and gain control over what exactly is happening.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Another one from Christine. What are some of the issues that have been encountered when performing a migration from another hosting platform to a Lagoon multi-site?
Yes, so that's a good question. If you have an environment that currently uses multi-site, so we did that before with other customers where we had to migrate 100 to 200 sites from an existing multi-site environment to the Lagoon multi-site system. And basically what we did is we're using Ansible for all kinds of automation. We basically built an Ansible script that is able to talk to the old hosting company, to the multi-site environment of that company, that hosting company, and it automatically talks to their API, figures out which sites are there, and takes out the code and builds new Git images, Git repositories with the multi-site structure that Lagoon provides. And this was a fully automated process. So we basically migrated 150 sites in roughly a day. Within 24 hours, we were able to migrate all of these sites from the old multi-site into the Lagoon multi-site environment without touching any single line of code. It was all fully automated. Because, and that's a good thing, the multi-site system is a very structured system. Each of the sites look very the same. So because of that, you can easily automate it. You can easily do it. We even had visual regression testing where we deployed the site first into Lagoon and synchronized the database, ran it, and then ran a visual regression testing to compare it to the currently old production site to the new production site and make sure everything is working. So this is completely possible. And we also had to disable some modules because the other hosting company, for example, had a special search API module. And so we had to disable that first and install the regular because Lagoon does not require specialized modules or so. So that's all possible with the power of Ansible and the scriptability and the API first stuff of Lagoon. Again, that's not something you're building in a day and probably also not in 2 days, but it's fully possible and we're happy to help writing these scripts, and they're also going to be open source. So if somebody's also be interested in doing that themselves, they're going to be open source very soon.
Wonderful, thank you. So the last question is from Yuri. Are there any possibilities to have a UI to manage sites, spawn and shut down them? He's thinking of something like the Site Factories UI.
Yes. So the Site Factories UI is definitely one thing that we want to get feature parity in Lagoon. So Lagoon, the UI right now allows you to manage sites after they have been spawned. And new sites, if you want to create a new site, we have some Ansible scripts that do that. But the end goal of the Lagoon UI is that all of that management of adding new sites, removing them, stuff like that, is going to be fully able via the Lagoon UI. And we are working with our current customers that use that system already. We're working together with them. And all of that features that we're implementing are going to be open sourced. So that's one key thing that we say. If you want to use Lagoon and if you're using via Maze.io, if we implement the feature for you, we're going to open source it back to the community. And that's what's happening there. So you can definitely expect in the near future managing tools, managing UIs to manage these Drupal multi-sites. And yes, we definitely have high expectations ourselves. Like we're imagining a UI which shows you which site is currently updated, what is their status, things like that. So it's all coming because we see the container system can, specifically for the need of multi-sites, can solve that problem. And so we really want to focus on that right now and implement tools and systems that make management of that very easy.
Wonderful, thank you. So yeah, that was the last question. If somebody else has a question, write them down now and we catch up with that one. Okay, no questions anymore.